Continuing our discussion of Dante's Inferno, the first of the books of the Divine Comedy, we're going today to enter into the circle of the heretics. Now, last time, over several episodes, we talked about the circle of lust. And just to remind you, lust for Dante is part of a pattern of, well, you can say sins of the flesh. These are sins of incontinence. They're sins of lacking self-control. They're sins in which, from Dante's point of view, and from a broader medieval point of view, you have desire, in a sense, ruling over reason and will instead of the other way around. And this is captured in Francesca's love, which absolves no one from loving. And since love made me do it. And I think Dante is very wise to sort of begin early on with a sin as sort of widespread as lust, a sin that, by the way, Augustine talks about as an almost universal sin. Almost everybody is tempted in some way in this area. And Augustine himself, of course, in his Confessions, utters one of the most famous lines about this in Western literature. He has a prayer to God, which he's making almost with a certain whimsical tone. He goes, "Make me chaste, O Lord, but not yet." It's kind of like he wants to arrive at virtue, but he's sort of having too much of a good time along the way. Now, Dante goes on from the circle of lust to talk about other sins of incontinence, sins like gluttony, and in other words, the incontinence of food and drink, and also incontinence regarding money. And interestingly, when Dante treats incontinence regarding money, he has two groups of people in the sort of money circle, the hoarders and the wasters. And I think what's interesting about this is that for Dante, whether you hold on to money really tight, like I won't give it up, it's kind of a way of saying that is that this kind of lust for money is causing me to not spend, to be overly frugal. But Dante sees wastefulness as reflecting exactly the same attitude, which is to say, all I care about is money and all I care about is my sort of extravagant lifestyle. And so I'm going to invest my hopes and energies in that. And so these are the various forms of incontinence that Dante treats. But we're going to move a little swiftly because what we're doing here is we're not doing a line-by-line, canto-by-canto reading of the Inferno. We're finding interesting signposts along the way. And so we're going to move out of the circle of incontinence, and we're now moving into the second category of sins. So there are three big categories of sins in the Inferno: the sins of incontinence, which I've mentioned, the sins of violence. And the sins of violence, by the way, are divided into three parts: violence against others, violence against self, and violence against God and nature. So we'll talk about that presently. And then sins of fraud. And fraud itself is divided into two categories. You can call it loosely simple fraud and sort of deep fraud or complex fraud. And what makes fraud complex? Well, what makes fraud complex is fraud is especially bad when it is committed against people who are in our special care or people with whom we have a special bond of trust. So that's further down, in a sense, deeper into the bowels of the Inferno. But on our way to the circles of violence, which we'll talk about, there's another circle, a kind of circle that doesn't seem to fit the schema all that well, and that is the circle of the heretics. Now, Dante admits that he has taken his schema for the Inferno sort of from the classical tradition. He's taken classical virtues and inverted them. And that's where he gets incontinence. Incontinence, for example, you can see is the opposite of moderation. And similarly, violence and fraud are sort of the polar opposites of classical virtues. But heresy, Dante says, doesn't fit this because the classical in classical antiquity, they weren't concerned specifically about Christian truth and Christian doctrine. And so Dante says we have to add this in because, of course, in a Christian poem, we have a grave sin, which is the sin of heresy. But Dante doesn't treat heresy in the normal way. So heresy, what is heresy? Well, the actual meaning of the word heresy is deviating from a straight path. So the straight path is the path of, you may say, orthodoxy, which is the right way. And heresy is falling away from that right way. So in the kind of dictionary definition, a heretic is someone who rejects the formal teaching of the church. The church has, in Christianity, you have doctrines. Let's say, for example, the doctrine of the Trinity, which is that God the Father, God the Son, God the Spirit are three persons, but all in one God. And they're equally three, and yet they are one. And so rejecting God's oneness is a heresy. At the same time, insisting that God is one, but that the Son, God the Son and God the Spirit are somehow lesser than the Father, that's a different type of heresy. And in early Christianity, you had a kind of profusion of heresies, many of them condemned by the early church councils. And one might expect that you find all those guys, the Manichaeans, the Albigensians, the Pelagians, those kinds of sort of heretics from early Christianity. You'll find them all in here in the circle of the heretics. But no, Dante treats the subject in such an interesting way. He comes across two prominent figures in the circle of the heretics. One is a politician named Farinata, and the other is a poet named Cavalcanti. And Farinata and Cavalcanti are the two kind of sinners, evil spirits that Dante converses with in the circle of the heretics. This is, by the way, also a very famous circle. And this is a very instructive conversation that Dante has. But at the face of it, you might start by saying, wait a minute, Farinata is a politician, a Florentine political figure. It turns out a Ghibelline, in other words, a member of the rival party to Dante. Dante was a Guelph, and if you recall, the Guelphs are the party of, you may say, the Pope, and the Ghibellines are the party of the empire. So Farinata is a Ghibelline. He's a kind of a member of a rival family to Dante's. And the question is, what on earth does a conversation about politics and poetry? I mean, admittedly, these are topics of great interest to Dante. Dante was a politician in Florence in the year 1300, where the poem is set. Dante is also, of course, a poet. So you can see why he would be interested in having a political conversation, having a conversation about poetry. But why would he put these guys in the circle of the heretics? And I think as we begin to look more closely at these conversations, we begin to see that Dante has a much subtler and deeper understanding of heresy. For him, it's not just a matter of, here's a teaching, you reject it, you break with it, you're a heretic. No, for him, heresy is something else altogether. And as we begin to look at these two very different figures, and we constantly have to do the work of asking, what is it that these two very different guys, who are, by the way, sharing the same tomb. In the circle of the heretics, by the way, there are flaming tombs, tombs that are consumed by fire. And Dante is walking through these tombs, and in fact, he doesn't even see the sinners at first because, of course, there's a glare that's produced by the fire itself. When one of the tombs opens up and a man sort of almost Jack-in-the-Box style pops out and begins a conversation with Dante, and what he says and how he says it is a topic we'll take up next time.